Hello, team, and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce. This is the Ukraine War Frontline update for the 18th of June 2023. Let's get straight to the northeast axis. So this is the Kupiansk up here to Svatva to Kreminna front line. On my map, that looks something like this. Kupiansk up here, Svatva there. There's been some reports of some activity around Novoselivska, which is just to the west of Kuzmivka there, and Berestova. That is the Berestova near Svatva, not the one down south on the way to Bakhmut. As we know from Ukraine, there are very many multiple names of same names of different villages, all in very close proximity. Although that one isn't so close. Okay, we come down. There is talk of activity around Bilohorivka. If we go to the ISW, they say that, as I mentioned, some of those places, a bit of activity going on there. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces conducted localized ground attacks west and south of Kreminna on the 17th of June. The Russian MOD claimed that Russian forces repelled Ukrainian attacks near Bilohorivka and Verkhnoko-Mayanka. Okay, so it's the Ukrainians attacking here, Bilohorivka and Verkhnoko-Mayanka. That's in the Seversk area. Indeed, Poulet-Volant has a map of this area, which suggests that there are some gains for the Ukrainians in this area near Spurna, just north of Spurna between Verkhnoko-Mayanska, and Spurna. So that is taking place there. The Russian Southern Group of Forces spokesperson claimed that Russian forces also repelled Ukrainian ground attacks near Rozdalivka, Vesela, and Yakovlivka. So that's just north of Bakhmut, and we'll go there next. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces also attacked in the Serebyanska forest area. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hannah Maliar acknowledged that Ukrainian forces continue both counter-offensive and defensive operations in eastern Ukraine. There are places where the Russians are on the attack, and there are places where the Ukrainians are clearly on the attack as well. One of the places where the Ukrainians seem to have made gains is in the Rozdalivka area, as was mentioned by the ISW there. We go to this source. Global War Monitor says Ukraine has advanced slightly towards Mykolivka, which is north of Solidar. The Russian artillery was shelling Ukrainian soldiers, evacuating a wounded Ukrainian soldier there. So that's geolocated evidence that the Ukrainians have made some advances just south of Rozdalivka, which is just here. So Ukrainian gains around there. That is reflected on, it's actually reflected on Deep State map. But just to remind you of how I do my mapping, and I don't continue the Deep State map around the corner here, there is a few changes to the Deep State map. They are 48 to 72 hours behind, so they have an operational security that the other mappers aren't bound by. So that's worth bearing in mind. My lines are all Russian defensive lines. So anything beyond that will be grey zone. And there'll be, whether there are differences of opinion between, say, the blue line here and the red line, which is blue is Andrew Perpetua pro-Ukrainian, red line is Syriac Mats pro-Russian, where there's that difference that can be explained by grey line and not having confirmation there. But it certainly looks like there have been gains made by the Ukrainians here, as according to both Andrew Perpetua's map and Deep State map, if I was to take that around the corner. Syriac Maps hasn't mapped for a couple of days. There's no updates, and I don't know what the reason are. They're a bit sporadic at the moment, so that could explain why there is some difference in certain areas. So as we come down to Bakhmut, there are the usual claims about Bakivka, Yahidny area here. If we go back to the ISW and talk about what they say of Bakhmut, the geolocated footage shows that Russian forces made advances near northern Myos. We'll come to that later. It's just south of Bakhmut. Of Bakhmut itself, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Maliar stated that the intensity of combat operations in this area has decreased, and that Ukrainian forces continue counteroffensive efforts around Bakhmut. Russian Central Group of Forces spokesperson claimed that Russian forces repelled Ukrainian attacks around Bakivka and Yahidna, and another Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces conducted sporadic attacks northeast and southwest of Bakhmut, but that Russian forces still control Bakivka, Yahidny, and Klishchivka. There are sort of various claims, as you can imagine, of activity and who controls what in these areas. There are general claims that the Ukrainians are making advances still in the north and the south of Bakhmut, to the north and south in these flanks, but not too much detail coming out of there. I think the Ukrainians are now pressuring across the canal. There was, if you look at Andrew Perpetua's map, where he has arrows, kind of where we know that there are attacks going on, and it seems like the Russians aren't attacking so much in this area. They were trying to, push back across the canal again to retake some of this ground that they had lost. I think it's now Ukrainian attacks more in this area, but those things can change on a daily basis. And then, yeah, not too much news of activity in the north. Now, if we come, so things are still happening around Bakhmut, but perhaps slightly decreased activity there, just enough, I guess, to fix the Russian troops if that is the Ukrainian intention. Now, as we come down to the Mayorsk area, which is to the south of Bakhmut, Kupiansk, Odzaryanivka, and we come down to Mayorsk here, so that's Mayorsk. This is a railway junction, and the canal comes down there as well. The Russians are pushed more to the east of the canal in this area, behind the railway line there. Let's see what is said about marginal Russian gains here. Sometimes I'm dubious, or quite often, about those marginal Russian gains that the ISW claims, because I think they're using, mapping that's very different to mine. So we'll see. These are so the claim is 60th Battalion Polish Wolves of the 104th Territorial Defense Brigade shells a group of Russian soldiers south of Odzaryanivka. So these are Russian positions being shelled. And that's exactly where I'd expect them to be, right on the front line, and exactly where I'd expect Ukrainians to be shelling. So that, to me, again, does not at all indicate geolocated Russian marginal advances. That's basically the Russians are where we think they are. So again, I don't quite understand that. Although it's always, I find these useful because it confirms my mapping rather than tells me. Occasionally there are advances, but generally it tells me that the Russians are where I think they are, or the Ukrainians are where I think they are. Anyway, to continue, that is Mayorsk. We go now to Avdiivka, so we'll zoom out a little bit, pop down south here, and there has been quite a bit of activity, although the details of it I'm not sure of. And the activity is reflected in Deep State's mapping, where there is quite a significant gain for the Ukrainians in this area. And it could, so this is Vasily. I don't know if it's actually marked on the map. It doesn't, it's one of these odd places that just doesn't turn up on the map. But there is somewhere around here is the settlement of Vasily, whether it's this part or whether it's actually here. So if we go to claims here, Vasily, if we look at the map, this is, Vasily is just to the northeast of that reservoir. So we go back to my map, that reservoir there. So it's here. So this is Vasily there. And that there's been some gains. So I think the line originally went down here. In fact, if we now turn on the line for the 30th of May for Deep State map, which is a line that JR did for me, we can see what advances have been made. So yeah, that's where it previously was. So the white line shows where Deep State map had the Russian lines on the 30th of May. Now, that doesn't always mean much compared to the blue and red mapping lines, because they might have had different lines on the 30th of May anyway, but it does give you a bit of an indication of what gains might or might not be made, particularly in the south, in the Zaporizhia area, where there's a lot more movement. But you can see there that that area is what has changed overnight. I will take that off, but I'll turn that back on in a second when we get to the southern area. Okay, so not too much detail about that from anywhere else, just a kind of mapping change, but it seems like the Ukrainians have had some success there. As far as the rest of Avdiivka is concerned, if we come down to the ISW, there's quite a bit of talk about Marinka, just usual kind of repelled attacks near Stepova and Adiivka. So Stepova is to the north, just there near Krasnohorivka, but nothing too much to report. So we'll pop down. There was talk about quite a bit of talk about Marinka here. And one thing as a pro-Ukrainian that would worry me is the claim about Pobyeda. So Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces made gains north of Marinka, attacked southeast of Krasnohorivka. So this is another Krasnohorivka. That's there. So attacking possibly in this direction. There's a Krasnohorivka just north of here of Avdiivka as well. So it's always worth making sure you have the right one. And that, yeah, and are consolidating areas near Pobieda reportedly captured within the last week. So this is the Russians having consolidated gains around Pobieda. Now, this bit of mapping from Syriac map to pro-Russian mapper has been there for like 2 weeks, and I've not seen any confirmation of Russians actually controlling part of Podbieda, which is a really important, very tiny place. So a kind of rural settlement that is it enables the Ukrainians to hold out in Marinka and not be encircled. If the Russians were to take Podbieda, then that makes encircling far easier because they could get through here and then come behind Marinka. Marinka does seem like the Russians are making gradual gains there, and the Ukrainians will eventually lose it. But at what cost? I mean, it's just a completely destroyed place. There's no such thing as liberation where you look at Marinka, where Marinka is concerned. But consolidating gains around here would be worrying. I don't know whether that would be there elsewhere around here, or do you know what I mean? There are areas towards or near does a lot of legwork for mappers, I think. So that is a little bit of a worry. If we now, oh goodness, I did forget to show you this as well, as far as Vercelli is concerned. According to Deep State, yeah, if you manage to take up advanced positions near the small hamlet of Vercelli, north of Adiivka, no visual confirmation yet. Separately, there were reports of increased fighting near Kamyanka over the last week. So that is just near Vercelli. So sorry, that's out of place. I just forgot to mention that confirming bit of evidence. So there's activity for looking beneficial for the Ukrainians there. But yeah, to go back to Marinka, it's looking tough for the Ukrainians there for sure, as it has done for an awful long time. The Russian MIDs claim that Russian forces repelled Ukrainian counterattacks near Novokalnyove, Pervomaisky, and Marinka. So that's again Ukrainian attacks going on in all of these places, including Marinka. So a place where both the Russians and the Ukrainians are attacking, as in other places too. So often the Russian MOD will claim they've repelled Ukrainian counterattacks, and the Ukrainians will claim that the Russians that they've repelled Russian counterattacks, all in the same place. Okay, then we come down to Vuhledar on the southern Donetsk front. This is eastern Donetsk coming down here, and there's been activity by the Russians, I think, attacking towards Novomykhailivka, as well as possibly doing a counterattack north of Mikhailska towards Vuhledar, while the Ukrainians are attacking to the southwest near Pavlivka. So there are possibly multiple things going on in Vuhledar. If we come to the ISW, they say Russian forces continue offensive operations near Vuhledar yesterday, likely in response to Ukrainian territorial gains in that area. On June the 16th, the day before, the Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled Russian attacks near Novomykhailivka and Vodyane. So Vodyane is in here, so that would mean not at Vodyane, but towards it from Solodka, where the Ukrainians have made some gains in Solodka a couple of weeks ago. It could be that the Russians are just trying to retake lost ground there. Okay, so that is, as we start to come on to the southern front line, we are now going to move towards Novodonetsk here, where there's activity between there and Velika Novosilka, and there's been activity in all the usual places around here. If I turn on the 30th of May map, let's have a look, or line, you can see what the Ukrainians have achieved as according to Deep State map in that area, and down just south of Orikhiv in a very intense fighting that's been taking place there that have had quite a bit of Ukrainian losses, and then over here near Lobkove as well. So there are gains today, possibly, in the last 24 hours around a village there, but we'll get to there. So we'll start over here near Velika Novosilka, Novodonetsk, and so on. I'll leave that line up to give you an indication. Shouldn't be too confusing. I'm sure your brain can cope with 3 colors. Right, so remember, pro-Russian mapper in red, pro-Ukrainian mapper in blue, but the pro-Russian mapper hasn't updated for 2 days that I can see. So bear that in mind. Let's have a little bit of an overview then of what is going on in this front line in general. Evil Gherkin, who is a pro-Russian nationalist, says that this source says the Russian war criminal and former FSB Spetsnaz, Evil Gherkin, predicts Russia's collapse if Ukraine is able to break through the current front line, which he calls the thinnest thread on which everything hangs for Russia. And I would agree with that. However, breaking through that front line is the challenge. So when you look at the war map here, you can see just how extensive those defensive lines are. These red lines that we see all over the shop in the Zaporizhia area. So it's yes, if the first line of defense is properly broken, these trench line defenses, then Russia could be in trouble because I don't think they've got enough troops to kind of defend effectively in particularly if the first line is broken in several places. And as you can see here, this is a slightly zoomed in map, the war map of the front line. And we're talking about this area up here, which is an area that doesn't have those trench lines particularly. When, and I'll come to this later because there's a map that shows it, but when the Ukrainians are trying so hard to break through in Orikhiv, and you see that there's almost like 3 lines of defense here. So 1, 2, 3 over, tens of kilometers. And then you look down here and you think there's no lines of defense, and then you get this one here, and then possibly it's easier to get through here. You can see why Velika Novosilka is one of the areas that they're really trying hard to break through. This, to me, just from looking at trench lines visually, I mean, you have the same opinion, right? This looks like the weakest area along the front line, and that's where I'd be putting a lot of attention. But of course, if you put all your attention there, then it's like shooting fish in a barrel because all of your troops will be concentrated here. So you need to be like prodding and probing throughout the front line, across the front line, to try and find other weaknesses, because you can't just pile in one place. That would be, I think, maybe a bit too concentrated. Anyway, to look elsewhere, Ukrainian troops lighting up more Russian defense lines by using mine clearing charges. Could be the M58 Miklik or the UR-77. So they will be using lots of these bits of kit. This area's particularly had scorch marks before the latest charge went off, probably somewhere in the south. So I know that Andrew Perpetua, and I'll be talking to him about his mapping tomorrow in a live stream, so check that out. But he checks out satellite imagery for scorch marks from these, scorch marks from thermobaric munitions, and shelling marks from the latest satellite imagery. So he's on it with regard to that kind of stuff. Okay, before we go to look at Velika Novosilka a bit more closely, Ukrainian commander of the Tavria group of forces says Ukrainian troops destroyed or damaged 77 units of Russian military equipment on the southern front on June the 17th. So yesterday, 77 pieces of Russian equipment were destroyed or damaged. That is hugely attritional. However, there will be large numbers of Ukrainian losses as well. This is expensive for the Ukrainians. I've seen certain claims about the Ukrainians from Russian sources, but I'm not. One of them particularly says there had been like a massacre somewhere for the Ukrainians and they're just throwing in bodies, but it was completely unverified by point of fact that I couldn't even tell who had made that claim. So there was just a bit of text that was screen grabbed and didn't even tell me who had made that claim. So I'm not showing you that, but just to let you know that there are Russians claiming that Ukrainians are losing huge amounts of both equipment and troops, and that will fit in line with some of the claims that, say, for example, Putin is making, and the MOD themselves are making. So, is there an element of truth to the claim that the Ukrainians are losing large numbers? I expect they will be losing fairly large numbers because even the UK intelligence updates today said that both sides are losing large numbers, but the Russians are just losing more. So it's a bit like the Bakhmut calculation again. Okay, here we have the Russian Cascade group targeting an T-72 tank of the Ukrainian army, and you can see this. There's Novodonetsk there, as far as I can work out from that. Translate that writing, and then to the northeast we have this tank, northwest, sorry. So just to let you know that back on my map, so we go here. Here's Novodonetsk is here. There we are. So that is where we're talking about a Ukrainian tank somewhere around here. So that's exactly where you expect the tank to be, and that being presumably targeted and taken out by the Russians there. Uh, and there you can see it getting taken out. So that's a Ukrainian tank getting taken out there. We have a claim here that Russian Ka-52 helicopters targeting 2 Ukrainian military equipment, pieces of equipment on the Volodar-Velika-Novosilka front with guided anti-tank missiles. These are a bit of a problem, the helicopters. Now, the Russians lost 2 Ka-52 helicopters yesterday. So the ramification or the corollary of taking out Ukrainian pieces of equipment with helicopters is you're putting your helicopters in harm's way and you will lose airframes. And they are. So they lost 2 yesterday, which I think is either 4 or 5 in the last week. And that is a large number of attack helicopters to lose. And more importantly, it's a large number of crew to potentially lose as well. I mean, I don't know if the crew perishing those, but potentially that is a lot of trained crew members being taken out. And so, yes, the helicopters are a serious problem for the Ukrainians, but also it means that the Russians are going to be losing them at a much greater rate. Okay, what else to mention? So the Birds of Magyar destroyed 2 Russian tanks, T-80 BV tanks, one for the 60th Motor Rifle Brigade in Staromayorsk, and the other for the 70th Motor Rifle Regiment in Zativna, south of Velika Novosilka. So there is so much footage of Ukrainian drones hitting stuff all over the shop. So here we're talking about Staromayorsk, and then even further down in Zavitne Bazhanya, that is drone activity there. And it's always useful to get an idea of how far that is. So that's about 5 kilometers, which would be stretching it for those kind of drones, I think. Why that's important is it means that the Ukrainians really are going to be around here if they're using drones to hit stuff down here, those kind of first-person view drones and whatnot. The range on them, I might need to look into that, but I think it is, when they say they're hitting places here, it means that, okay, they've definitely got control of Makarivka, for example, would be what I would, that's my reading between the lines. So anyway, there's so much footage of FPV drones taking out stuff. There's an awful lot, and I showed on news, there's an awful lot of footage of FPV drones hitting foxholes and trench lines in these areas, or not like the full-on massive trenches that we're talking about further to the south, but just your smaller trench lines in the tree lines, or in some of these fields where you've got, tiny little foxholes that the Russians are hiding in, and they're getting hit consistently. But the flip side is that Ukrainians have reported that they're pretty well built. Some of these hideouts are undetectable by sort of thermal imagery at night and whatnot, because the Russians have apparently done a much better job of digging some of these than Ukrainians themselves do, is the admission. So that will be a challenge for the Ukrainians. Right, the Ukrainian army has destroyed a T-80 BV tank in Zativna Bazhanya. So that's the one that I was just talking about in a previous tweet there, but this one actually shows it. So you've got the tank being followed for some time and then being taken out by the first-person view drone. I think what is interesting about this bit of footage is that this is a RPG-7 warhead on a first-person view drone that is hitting the tank in its weakest spot, or one of its weakest spots, from behind, and it comes in, hits it from behind, and so here we see it hitting it there, and all the crew members get out and run off. And that is to say that even these RPG-7 warheads that technically should struggle against the, or certainly would on more modern tanks, I think, are still having success on some of these T family tanks. Now, it's not a huge damage there, and I don't know whether what's interesting is they all run out and don't try and put the fire out. So I don't know whether this is this signifies something to do with their training, or whether it's just, it is a training to get out, it's look after yourself, see if anything happens to that, then come back to it if it's safe enough to do so. But they all kind of run off, and then I just don't know whether that is enough damage on that tank to mean that you can't, that it's done for. As you can see, there seems to be like a secondary explosion just there previously. Anyway, that's just more stuff being destroyed in the general area. And then we move to the west. So I have hardly any information about what is going on with these particular places. I have a feeling, I mean, this is Priutna is being hammered, I think, by artillery and uh, drones and whatnot. So I'm fairly sure there's fighting near there. Rivnapil, I've heard nothing about. Staromayorska and Urizhine appear to be where they are fighting still today. But I think it's just slow, incremental gains along this area. It's just not easy. The Russians are definitely defending. Right, we're going to move to the west, past Marfapil, past Droznyanka. And I don't know of any information about Droznyanka. I know, pretty sure there is activity there, as indicated by people like Warmapper saying, that is contested. But a lot of the information is about the area to the south of Orikhiv here. Just to zoom out a little bit, give you a sense of where we are. Orikhiv there, and it seems like there have been gains. Andrew Perpetua's map has changed from pretty much that to taking some ground to the south to where it is now, the blue line. That's a pro-Ukrainian mapper. So south of Orikhiv, it could be, and Malotokmachka, that the Ukrainians are making gains, and this is towards Roboterna. So Roboterna is the place that gets mentioned. Advances at Roboterna. This is from the Russians, but the Google Translate is a bit dodgy. The enemy is leading a powerful offensive, having reached trenches. He's trying to break through and wedge himself into our fighting on the Zaporizhia front. Now, it appears to be the actual kind of trench lines that we see here. So this is Roboterna. You can see the trench lines there. They are fighting over the first line of defense, and the argument would be from Igor Gherkin that if that is broken there, then it could be that the Russians are in trouble, because he says their defense is too thin, and that's coming from a Russian source. So ours have left one advanced position. This is the Russians. And the enemy went to her, and now he's covered with all the guns. The enemy is trying to break through further. Tanks came to the aid of our infantry. Company tactical groups of the armed forces of Ukraine with armored vehicles continue to attack. Massive fires being conducted on them. So it's a bit garbled, but you get the idea. And it appears that I mean, they mentioned in that, I didn't say it, but because it was a bit garbled, the English, but they're talking about this area here near Verbova. So there is advances towards Roboterna, but activity all in this area there. So if we just come along, this next source kind of talks to that. Heavy fighting in this area tonight, per Russian reports. That's last night. At the moment, unclear what is going on, but there's confirmation that Ukrainians have occupied new positions previously held by the Russians. So that's Roboterna, and that's for Verkova there. So it could be that the Ukrainians have moved further on than my map suggests. As you can see here, there are trench lines there, but this is a really dense area of dense trench lines and fortifications. So this is a particularly difficult place to attack. I think I was talking about this in the news piece this morning, which is that no wonder they've lost a lot there. And is it wise to continue hammering at this area, because this is where they've got the kind of most, the densest fortifications? But then that's because Tokmak really is that important. That's why they hammer Tokmak with HIMARS on a nightly basis, and so they really want to take that. That's your stepping stone to Melitopol and to the south. But in order to get there, one of the sort of closest ways to get there is through this Roboterna area and allow the use of these roads. But that means getting through. The Russians obviously knew that, so this is where they built their their biggest fortifications, or the most lines of fortification. So it's difficult, as you could expect. It's war. Here another source saying operational situation in the this is going on now to the Vasilivsky direction. So now we're going to move slightly to the west. So just to let you know that that white line is the 30th of May. So you can see there the gains that have been made. Not huge. I mean, we're talking a good sort of Now, it's coming on for 2 weeks of this counteroffensive. You can see how grinding it's going to be. And then we have some gains around the Lobkova area, just south of Stepova, Mali Shabaki. This village, Piatikatki, has been talked about lots. There's a video 2 days in a row by reporting from Ukraine talking about how they've finally taken this place, and it's been about this forest area here that the Ukrainians took by having a kind of I suppose not quite lightning offensive, but they drive in all their troops, drop them off, then get the equipment out of there so it's not hit and it's much more mobile. They took this forest area, but then unfortunately the Ka-52 attack helicopters came and pushed the Ukrainians out. Well, then they smoked out this whole area, which is kind of low ground, as reporting from Ukraine says here. They then, let off a load of smoke in this area, in this low ground, which was perfect sort of place for that smoke to be used, and then that allowed them to take the village. So there's lots of talk about that village being taken. Let's go back to these sources. So Piatikatki village liberated. Fighting continues on the outskirts on several fronts. Russian forces have been completely driven out from the village, as according to that source. And then here, unconfirmed information, but the occupiers retreated from the important settlement of Piatikatki in the Zaporizhia region. Quote, the Ukrainians are drawing up large reserves, and the capture of Piatikatki provides an opportunity to advance to Vasilivka, and that's from a Russian source. Vasilivka there is close to the reservoir and is one of the westernmost points of the offensive, one would think. Russian occupation authorities claim that Ukraine took control of Piatikatki in Zaporizhia, according to Reuters. Ukrainian officials didn't officially claim the liberation of the settlement yet, so you can see it's coming from a number of places. And then footage released by Russian channels from Piatikatki, Ukrainian heavy equipment and infantry troops can be seen inside the village, while Russian artillery is trying to hit them. Some broken, damaged pieces of equipment can be seen. So, in other words, there's geolocated footage to confirm that that is indeed the case, that Ukrainians have taken that. Russian sources are reporting that Russian units have once again been forced to withdraw from the town of Piatikatki on the Lubkova front line in Zaporizhia region. They further admit that Ukrainian forces, including infantry and mechanized equipment, have been able to establish a foothold in the settlement, most likely for an upcoming advance on the city of Vasilivka. But the Russian artillery is continuing to strike these positions inside and outside of Piatikatki. So just on my map here, it's fighting around Zerebianka now. That's where it's kind of happening. The gains are, as you can see there, with a view to attacking to the southwest towards Vasilivka there, which is a logistical node that will allow multiple sort of approaches then on to further down south to Melitopol. So this is quite a key place. There's been a lot of activity around Mykolaiv with regard to HIMARS striking there and munitions taking out positions in Mykolaiv. Right, and then finally here we have no report saying clarification that that village is under Ukrainian control but not fully cleared yet. Fighting reached the outskirts of Zerebianka while simultaneously attacking Luhove. So he's talking about, and again, this is from this morning though. So he's saying it's actually not fully under Ukrainian control, and that there is fighting around Zerebianki and towards Luhove as well. So it could be that you start to see the Ukrainians advance along here. This settlement of Kamyanska is divided by the river that goes through it, and over the previous months Ukraine had the north under their control and the Russians the south. So whether they'll be able to use this bridgehead across the river in order to take the settlement to the south of the river rather than trying to get across the river, I think that would be more likely. So we might see some activity there. Just to go back to what Null Report said, I've added logical targets on the map blocking supply lines to Kamyanska and one through Horova and Nestarienka. So it could be that this is what the targets are for the Ukrainians now. As we look a little bit closer, it's Hrozove there. So it says that if we come down south here, that could be where they look to go to cut supply routes and Lhove as well, and then effectively cut off Kamyanska, the Russians that might be there. Anyway, that's what's happening on the front line. not a massive amount of detail, but it is because it's a grinding offensive. One might think that if they punch through some of these trench lines, then it might become quicker, especially once they get through this whole area of defense. If indeed they do, then there's much more open land, and they will be able to use roads much more easily and can move far more quickly around the oblast. But at the moment, it's a case of trying to grind their way through these defenses. Anyway, that's all I have to say today. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Sorry it's been a bit longer. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.